Well, your job as a foreign correspondent over the years has been a matter of the hot wars and the cold wars, right?
Yes, yes.
Which is the most difficult to cover?
Well, the hot wars are more difficult in terms of personal courage, but in a way that makes them easier too, because your adrenaline is always up, you're always very excited, you're stimulated. As you know better than I, the foreign correspondent likes to walk on the brink, wants the intensity of emotions all the time. You live it. I used to say that after 5 weeks of covering things, I would feel I had lived 5 years. And it was because of the intensity. Every day, we were seeing things that most people wouldn't see once in their lifetime. And you get a totally different idea about time doing this. I think what I've found the most difficult in recent years is covering, at the same time the most gratifying, what I call the irregulars, the guerrilla movements, the terrorist movements, the kinds of leaders and people who are shaping the modern world, but whom the diplomats and the regular people don't talk to.
Well, very few people do talk with the irregulars. What is the role of the journalist, as you see it, in relation to the irregular?
Well, this is something that I see as very, very new, because in effect we've become the new diplomats, not by commission but by omission. Say in Central America, where I lived in '66 with the Guatemalan guerrilla movement, slept on the ground with them, lived with them for a week. No American diplomat could speak to these young men. Nobody, they were forbidden from talking to them and still are. Yet Central America is now in flames because of these people. And we journalists were the only ones who could get to them. And it didn't matter whether you agreed with them or not, or liked them. That wasn't the point. No value judgments are personal. But you sure better know who these people are who are forming the world and who are about to send you into these cataclysms.
I remember working with the Partigiani in northern Italy in World War II. And at first there was some distrust of us as correspondents, but we were accepted as time went on. Did you find that you were being accepted by the guerrillas? Did they trust you, or were you the only avenue through which they could speak to the world?
They tested me very carefully. In fact, in each condition, whether it was Guatemala, whether it was Salvador, whether it was with the PLO, other Palestinian groups, African groups, and they would say, well, we're going to know more about you than even your mother knows. And my response always was, that's exactly what I want. And if you don't, you're going to put me in danger. I want you to be so sure of me that I'm no threat to you at all. That worked. Also, a very odd thing came into play here, which is that I'm absolutely convinced that because I was a woman, I had an advantage with them. Because most of these young men, or not so young men, were Marxists, or they were at least anti-American, anti-quote imperialist, unquote. But they were anti-American male. You would terrify them. You know, you're big, you're American. Whereas I was still a woman, and they would talk to me, they would forget. I was not a representative of the power of Washington. And I know that that came into play.
Give me an example of how they tested you. What did they do?
Well, that was all before they would decide to deal with me. And it was mostly in watching me and in seeing how I responded. And I would never flatter them, for instance. I was very professional. And some of the correspondents would go in and say, oh, we really agree with you, and be almost obsequious. And that was a mistake. I was absolutely convinced of it. I would be, as I say, very professional, somewhat distant, and say, I will do an honest job with you, etc. Now, with the Palestinians, it was a little different, because with them you had to sort of go around for a long time, and this was in Jordan in '69 when they were still there, and sort of prove yourself by taking interest in their different things, by watching them train, and not doing it too much either. It was always a balance to show that you're a good professional, that you're what I call the in-between people, somebody in between government and in between people, someone who can go out there individualistically and individually and be honest and forthright and sympathetic, but not too much so.
The role of the woman in the Arab society, as I'm sure you will agree, is quite different than other parts of the world. Did that present a problem for you?
I expected when I went over to the Middle East in the first time, which was '69, that it would cause an enormous problem. In fact, I was afraid that I would not be able to work there very effectively. And it could not have been more different. And analyzed that a good deal. In fact, I've had interviews with virtually every Arab and leader and most Israeli leaders and so on, from the Sultan of Oman to Saddam Hussein of Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And I began to wonder why it was going so well. And I really think that, again, being the only woman doing this raised different contours and sort of in their minds and in mine. I really think I became kind of a third sex to them. I was a woman, but I was a Western woman, and they would say to me, well, our women are raised under Islam, they're raised with Muslim rules, but you're not. You're Western, you're Christian, and we don't expect you to behave like our women. At the same time, I was the sort of eternal woman as listener, and they would enjoy talking to a Western woman. There was a different kind of edge to it. So all these things were coming into play.
Maybe that should be the title of your next book, The Third Sex. I think we all wonder about how much we are being used or what effort is being made to use us when we're working as correspondents. That bother you very much when you were working with the guerrilla forces, or any force for that matter?
Yeah, it bothers me, Clete, but I think it's not that hard to control, really. If you're not sentimental, if you're tough-minded, you know that yesterday's revolutionary is tomorrow's dictator. It's been all through history. And one of my rules of thumb is that you control the interview largely by what you know. The more you know about history, the more you know about the people, the more you know about their ideology, the more you control. The less you know, the more they control. You mustn't become sentimental as a correspondent. You mustn't become ideologically involved. You must keep this distance. Some don't, and they endanger all of us, very frankly. But when I was in Central America with the guerrillas, I knew that this was there. I knew this was a danger. And all I did was look at their ideology and see what their ideology says is what they will do. If they say they're Marxists, they will create a Marxist state.
Did you have any difficulty in your own mind maintaining that separation, that objectivity? Do you have to speak to yourself every morning? We're all guilty of enthusiasm,
sure,
you know.
Sure, and I think it's dishonest to say, well, I don't have any feelings, that I can be totally objective, I don't have any commitments, I don't have any beliefs, because we all have these, and we should have them. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I don't like the word objective very much, because that assumes that we're neuter inside, and we're not. We all have and should have beliefs. But what I think we can do, and what I try to do, is sort of pluck those feelings out, and those commitments, or even emotional feelings when I see people being killed or any number of horrible things, and say, yes, but I'm going to be fair to all sides and present all sides. And you know, one of the beauties to me of being a foreign correspondent is that we're the only ones that go to all sides. How many times have I had very good diplomats in our embassies say to me, oh, if I could only go and talk to the guerrillas, or if I could talk with the Palestinians or the Eritreans or whomever, and they can't. And so we're the ones that carry these odd little messages from all these different people, and then finally to the people out there, to the people who are reading.
What about the degree of trust that exists today between our embassy representatives around the world and the press? Are you working in a high level of adversary relationship?
Not so much anymore. That came to a peak. Well, I covered the Dominican Revolution. It was at a peak then. It was certainly at a peak in Vietnam. It was so bad, but it was also so strange that we had generals taking us aside in Vietnam and telling us personally that everything they had said in the briefing that day was false, and pointing us in the direction of other stories that were critical of the U.S. government. You know, it was such a crazy time. It was such an unusual time, and we mustn't forget that. I personally don't find that problem that much anymore throughout the world. I'm in very close contact with a lot of our diplomats, a lot of very close friends. When we disagree, we agree to disagree. When I think the policy is lousy, I say that, and they either defend it or don't. Mm-hmm. But I think we've gone through to another period at this point. I think the Vietnam syndrome is largely dead in the Foreign Correspondence Corps.
The Vietnam syndrome, meaning the
terrible adversary position between the government and the press, and the military and the press. But it was also between the government and the military, and the CIA and the government. Everybody disagreed. It was a terrible time.
Did you ever feel that the CIA was trying to use you? The CIA boasts, as you know, the disinformation, in quotes, the disinformation that they would plant with targets, meaning certain correspondents. Did you ever feel they were trying to use you that way?
I wish they tried a little harder, actually. They never gave me much at all. Whenever we talked, they wanted things from me or from us. No, you know, I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I assumed that life was going to be a struggle, and I consider it kind of a joyous struggle. I consider that they're trying to put their point across, and that our job is to go out there and find whether that point of view is true or whether it isn't. I don't expect them to feed us information. I expect a number of games to be played, albeit on an honorable level. I don't like it when they stoop to dirty tricks. But that's our job. That's what we do, or that's what we should be doing. We should be talking to all sides and getting as close as we can to a true situation, to what I call the little relative truths that are what correspondents and journalists in general come to. And journalists are the only ones who go out there, live with them underground or in the mountains or wherever, and we bring back the only information we have on them. So that's new. But another factor that's new is that, for instance, when I was living in the mountains in '66 with the Guatemalan guerrilla movement, this was a traditional movement. It was Marxist, but they were looking toward the future. It was what we would call progressive, not in any value judgment form, but a futuristic movement. Now we're covering people like the Khomeinis in Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Shiites there, whose revolution is completely toward the past. I mean, he wants to carry his people back 1,400 years. And when you're talking about a revolution like that, it's a very different thing, and it's a very different crowd of people that we're dealing with.
Well, when you were in Vietnam, and you were there several times, as I understand, were you keenly aware of the adversary relationship that existed between the press and the military? Did it touch you personally?
Yes, yes, it did. And it was, Clete, I think it was more than an adversary relationship. Everybody was against everybody else, including in the press corps. I've never seen a press corps where the foreign correspondents didn't get along together. Everybody hated everybody else. It was terrible. But also, for instance, I knew at least 2 generals who would take me aside in their office and say, look, everything we said at the briefing today was not true. Look into these stories. And they were tipping you off on stories that were anti-American involvement in the war. It was so poisonous that it became a poison for everybody.
Do you believe that, given our free press in a democracy, do you think it'll ever be possible again to sell a war such as Vietnam to the American public?
That's a very good question, and my tendency at the moment is to say no, unless it's something that is directly affecting America, American land, American people. And there's something that television does that's very good. In order to fight wars, you have to dehumanize people, and television does not allow you to dehumanize people. You see them, they're Vietnamese, they're Lebanese, they're Palestinians, they're just like us, basically.
What do you see for the future? I'm thinking of the Falklands War. Now, there's a war that was under the strictest censorship. I think you'll agree.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It was controlled.
Yes.
The British did a good job at keeping the correspondents bottled up on the ships and controlling every word that came out. Do you think there'll ever be another war reported as Vietnam was?
I'm really very worried about this. I see whole areas of the world just being closed down to us because the brutes of the world, whether they're the Marxist dictators or the rightist dictators, they just close down the gates and they can do anything they want behind there. And people who want to wage war know now not to let the journalists, not to let the correspondents in. There was an item on the front page of the Chicago Tribune the other day, the Iraqi-Iranian War, and a whole new front had opened, and the line was, but nothing could be confirmed because there were no foreign correspondents there.
Let's look to the future a moment. You've been reporting the Cold War for a long time, and that war does continue. But what do you see as the stories of the future? What are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about movements of populations, breakdowns of systems of government? What will it be, do you think?
I do see those as the stories of the future. I see what I call permanent disintegration of countries or permanent anarchy, like Lebanon, Uganda, Cambodia, and Iran, Syria, etc. I see massive movements of people, immigration across borders, perhaps of millions of people. Population pressure is so great that it will lead to war, as it did in El Salvador, for instance. I think those old, what used to be called the soft geopolitical issues, are going to be the hard ones of the future.
You think we'll be, as correspondents, patrolling the borders of the world in the future?
That's a very interesting question. That is something to think about.
Why? What's going to happen at those borders? They're going to come apart?
Well, look, just recently we've had the expulsion of 3 million Ghanaians from Nigeria because the oil boom collapsed. And it was a very brutal and very cruel and awful thing. Then we had the slaughter of Assamese in the northeastern province of India. And the Assamese were immigrants coming across the border. We're already seeing these kinds of stories. Now, these are not the ones that we've been trained or equipped or used to covering. But yeah, I do think these will be the stories of the future.
What about Eastern Europe? What do you see, and I won't use the word crystal ball, but you've been in and out of there. What do you sense?
There's another kind of revolution going on there, and that is very subtle, and that's hard for us to cover. Not for us in the print so much, but those in the television or media. The Polish story, which I've covered a lot, was not basically the demonstrations in the crowds. That was peripheral. The Polish story is the breakdown of the whole economic system within the communist bloc, the exhaustion of communism in Eastern Europe. Now that's a subtle, very complex story. It can be told in print quite easily enough, but it's not one that lends itself to films, and it's a slow motion revolution. Now, we've got to learn how to cover slow motion revolutions too, and not just cover the crisis spots.
So then you use the phrase the exhaustion of communism. Do you see at the same time any change in world attitudes towards democracy as we know it, as the word has a meaning to us?
I see a growing new passion for democracy, if anything.
Really?
Yeah,
How does that manifest itself?
Oh, I see it everywhere in the third world when I'm talking to the, I can tell when I go back and I talk to some of the young people that I talked to a few years ago, and they were all enchanted with Marxism. They basically all know now that it doesn't work, that it's not going to give them the economic advancement they want. With the guerrilla movements, the ones who call themselves Marxists, most of them are that way just to get arms from the Soviet Union. There's this, they call it the theory of superior arms from the Soviet Union, but they don't believe it's a superior ideology. I see absolutely a genuine new passion for representative government. That's a very hopeful thing.